First of all, I would say it's something to discover. You can discover it by looking at people that you admire, because if you admire people, that's the manifestation of an instinct to imitate. And so you could say that admirable people live out a certain pattern, and to imitate that pattern is to live in a meaningful way. And so you might ask, well, what are the constituent elements of that pattern? And so some of it is that admirable people, at minimum, take responsibility for themselves. So to the degree that they're able, they're not burdensome to others. They can take care of themselves, and with any luck, they have enough left over to take care of other people, maybe a family, maybe children, and maybe the broader community. So there's a balance between their own needs and wants across time and the needs and wants of others, familial first and then community later, and that all of those things are being addressed simultaneously. And there's a variety of reasons that that's useful. One is that it's a challenge, and challenges are meaningful, especially if they're taken on voluntarily, technically meaningful. And the second is that there's plenty of problems to be solved in the world that are deep and real, and if you happen to be involved in the solution to those problems, then you have something to be satisfied about when you consider your miserable existence. There is a wide variety of difference in temperament between people. So there are people who are morphologically male who have a more feminine temperament, and vice versa, because people are quite mutable. Whether that means that there are more than two genders depends entirely on how you determine to define gender. I think that, having said that this modern confusion about what constitutes gender and sex will do very few people any good and plenty of people lots of harm. The concept gender is so amorphous that discussing it scientifically is not particularly useful. There are two biological sexes. How that manifests itself in gender depends entirely on how you define gender. I mean, are there feminine males and masculine females? Well, clearly. Does that mean they're different genders? Well, that's a matter of definition, and usually that's so polluted by political discourse that it's impossible to have a reasonable conversation about it. I would say, generally speaking, that the discourse about gender is not aimed at freeing people to make appropriate choices in their life. It's part of an assault on the fundamental categorical structures of Western civilization. So the entire discussion is not what it seems by any stretch of the imagination. Is gender a spectrum? Well, it depends on how you define gender. Is sex a spectrum? Well, it depends on how you define sex. It's not a spectrum if you look at chromosomes. It is a spectrum if you look at other markers in some sense. So, but that's not the issue. The issue is why the entire issue has become so contentious and so much at the forefront of popular culture in the last 5 years. It's not particularly helpful in my estimation. Well, the distributions of temperament overlap more than they differ. So men and women are more the same than they are different. And that would be true at the level of brain structure as well. I mean, there's not a female brain and a male brain in that they're so morphologically distinct that there's no overlap. That's of course not, because human beings are, regardless of their sex, are more the same than they are different. But that doesn't mean that the differences aren't important in some aspects. You can have small differences on average that produce walloping differences at the extreme, and people don't understand that. So men and women differ, for example, in the degree to which they're aggressive. And you see that in all sorts of ways. Men are more likely to commit suicide successfully because they use lethal means. They're more likely to be physically violent in a destructive manner, which is why more of them are in prison. But the difference on average between men and women in aggressiveness isn't that great. But the extremes matter. And so these questions that the people are putting forward in this manner are ill-formulated, and so it's very difficult to answer them properly. Well, they're going to have to accept the fact that there are biological differences between men and women, for example, in the Scandinavian countries, because the data suggest that the outcome that was being pursued by the equality of opportunity doctrines didn't produce the outcome that was expected, because what's happened in Scandinavia is that men and women have become more different rather than more the same. And so, and that's driving variability in such things as occupational choice, and secondarily in terms of income. And so it doesn't look like you can pursue equality of opportunity doctrines to level the playing field and to allow everyone access to whatever occupation they might choose to select and get the same outcome across all occupational categories. That's not going to happen. And so people are going to have to accept that, because what's the alternative? And you know, you can say, and people do, well, the science is pseudoscience. It's like, fair enough, you can make that claim, but then you pretty much have to throw out all the social sciences and a good chunk of biology. And there are people who are perfectly willing to do that because they're so hell-bent on insisting that all the differences between men and women are socially constructed. But even then, that tends to be incoherent, because they also regard gender as a choice. It's like, well, if it's a choice, it's not a social construct. So I think a tremendous amount of that is a fad. And then there are other people who are not well situated in the classic male-female categories, and so they have a hard time. But that doesn't mean you blow the category structure completely. So, and leave everyone confused instead of a tiny minority of people confused. The fact that there are exceptions to a rule doesn't mean that the rule is invalid. It just means that there are exceptions. There are people with 3 arms. Right. That doesn't mean that we stop assuming that on average people have 2 arms. So there are exceptions. And then the question is, well, what do you do with the exceptions? You don't demolish the category structure because of the exceptions, not unless you want to confuse people dreadfully. And that's happening very, very rapidly, especially with like the emphasis on early transition of children with gender dysphoria. There's going to be lawsuits like you can't possibly imagine in 20 years when those kids hit adulthood and realize that they were making choices as children that weren't in the least appropriate. No, first of all, we can't. The idea that you decide how to socialize your children consciously into their gender roles is completely absurd. You don't sit and think every time you interact with a child, am I treating this child like a boy or like a girl? And if I'm treating the child like a girl, then I have to stop doing that and I have to substitute some other mode of interacting. You don't have the wherewithal to do that. Mostly what you're doing, if you have any sense, when you're interacting with a child, is taking most of your cues from the child. And so there were studies done a few decades ago looking at how people who wanted to raise their children in a more gender-neutral manner actually interacted with them, and there was no evidence whatsoever that their gender relevant behavior as parents was any different than the people who were raising their children hypothetically in the normative manner. So A, we don't know what would happen if you tried to raise children in a gender-neutral manner. It's a massive social experiment that's uncontrolled and unprecedented. And B, there's no evidence that you could do it anyways. And even if you could do it, there's no evidence that it would produce the outcome that you desire, which I presume would be what? More equality of outcome? More equal distribution of men and women across occupational categories? It's like, why would you do it? Is there something? Then the next question, this is a deeper question. Is there something wrong with the fact that there are males and females? Like, when did that become a problem? Is there something wrong with females? Yes or no? Is there something wrong with males? Yes or no? Fundamentally, so that the categories have to be blurred. Who's decided that? Well, I suppose I reconcile the two by giving some consideration to the place of consciousness, because consciousness isn't something that we understand at all. And as far as I'm concerned, consciousness is consciousness is best construed as the process that transforms potential into actuality. So you confront every day the possibilities of the day, and you know that they vary widely, that there's wise decisions that you could make, good decisions that you could make, and unwise decisions, and malevolent decisions, and that the nature of what is transformed into reality from the future is going to depend on your choices. Well, there's something about that that's mysterious, and something that's associated with divinity, as far as I'm concerned. And so I don't know what the source of that is, but the traditions upon which our culture is predicated insist that that's part of what gives people their unalienable value. And that strikes me as right. So I don't see a contradiction. That doesn't mean that I understand the relationship between a religious view that posits a transcendent reality and fundamental processes like biological evolution. But the fact that I don't understand everything about biological evolution or about transcendent reality doesn't make me despair that there's no meeting point. I mean, it's clearly the case that the religious instinct evolved. Anybody who's taking the phenomenon seriously understands that the religious instinct is very deep in people. So it's obviously a consequence, at least in part, of biological evolution. There's some touch point between material reality and our capacity to apprehend the transcendent. We have no idea to what degree that's driven our cultural evolution, but it's a lot more than the straightforward materialists presume. Well, science has virtually nothing to say about ethics. So science is about the world as it lays out itself objectively. It's the universe of facts, and there's an infinite number of facts. You still have to organize themselves into a schema for action, and that's a value structure. So you have to filter the facts through a structure of value, and the fundamental substructure of your value structure is religious, whether you know it or not. So, because you could think of a religious structure as something that imposes a hierarchy of importance from completely unimportant to absolutely vital, the highest value. So you could think of the religious impulse in some sense as the search for the highest value. And you're constantly involved in the application of value because you can't even look at something without making value judgments. I mean, you're sitting with me in the room. There's a million things you could look at in here. There's something you've chosen to look at. You've taken the entire world and all of its possibilities, all of the facts of the world, and you've collapsed them into a single thing. And you do that with a value structure that's deep and complex, and that has a religious substructure, the structure that you use to organize your perceptions. I don't think that we know the answer to that. You can certainly use scientific techniques to induce profound religious experiences. All you need to do is use psilocybin for that, or any of the classic hallucinogens, the psychedelics, can produce religious experiences on demand. And people regard those as among the most significant experiences they've ever had. Now, that doesn't say anything about the metaphysical reality of what's being experienced, but it certainly indicates that you can scientifically produce and analyze the phenomenology of religious experience. And then the evidence also suggests that the consequence of those experiences tends to be positive rather than negative, so that it's not merely an analog of insanity, which was a perfectly reasonable initial hypothesis. So, for example, at Johns Hopkins, they've used psilocybin mushrooms to produce smoking cessation among nicotine addicts with about an 85% success rate, assuming they have a mystical experience, and help people cancer patients overcome their fear of death. And the large-scale studies of hallucinogen use also don't seem to indicate that the consequences are negative. Now, they are for some people, and it's certainly possible to have experiences that are dreadful beyond imagining. So they're very powerful technologies, and they have to be used with extreme caution. But they certainly provide almost instantaneous indication that people have the capacity for profound metaphysical experiences that they themselves regard as evidence of something approximating the divine. Now, people respond to that in different ways, and I'm not saying that I understand what any of that means, but it's certainly accessible, at least in part, in the lab. Well, there's definitely a tendency in that direction for people to, it isn't even the fact that people construe themselves as victims that's the fundamental problem, although that's a fundamental problem, because it is the case that a fair bit of life is characterized by suffering. So it's an existential observation that human life is characterized in large part by suffering. The problem comes when you start to take that personally, assume that you're the specific target of unfair victimization and that someone else is to blame, someone else who has it better. Well, then that's not good. That sets the stage for all sorts of degeneration into tribal horror. That's a very worrisome development. I mean, look, people are disappointed in love, they're disappointed with themselves, they're tortured by the natural world, they're crushed in many ways by the social world. There's all sorts of arbitrary constraints that weigh upon you. And that's the case for everyone, and for some people more than others. But then to assume that that's the consequence of your oppression by an identifiable group, and then to decide to take action in that regard, it's like, well, that's a problem. Yeah, and it can be a big problem. It's very important, but as you move out of childhood dependence, you need to find a peer group and belong. That's what helps you learn to deal with other people in a reciprocal manner. So you have to develop your group identity, but your development shouldn't stop there. So childhood, well, you're dependent on your parents, and then you start to develop independence, but it's mediated by the group. You have to learn to get along with your peers, which is why that's so important, especially for teenagers. You have to take your place within a group to become a socialized member of humanity. But with any luck, out of that emerges someone who's also capable of being an individual. And so development that stops with group identity, in my estimation, is truncated. And it's partly because the individual who's autonomous is necessary for the continued health of the group, because a group thinks the same way. That's what makes it a group. And the problem is that the world changes. So if a group insists upon thinking only one way over any reasonable amount of time, then the world moves farther and farther away from the conceptions of the group as the environment shifts. You need people who can stand outside the group and say, no, that's wrong. This needs to be adjusted. You need to change your conceptions here so that the group can stay adapted to the shifting environment. And that's the role of the aware individual, which is why in the West we assume that the sovereign individual is the foundation of the state rather than the group per se. I mean, there's other reasons, but that's a start. Well, as you move towards individual responsibility, then you're capable of taking more and more on your shoulders. So maybe to begin with, you hope, if you have a child, you hope that by the time they're 19 or 20, they're starting to become capable of taking care of themselves. Then you hope that as they mature more, they can become perhaps capable of taking care of a family. And then maybe if they develop more, they become capable of taking care of their society. So there's, you're dependent as a child. You go through this process of group integration. You emerge as an individual. And then as you become more and more developed as an individual, you can take on more and more responsibility for broader and broader communities and organize that properly. There's no end to that capability because there's always new problems that can be solved and more competence, let's say, that can be developed or accepted and encouraged. That also gives you an ever-expanding horizon. You say, well, you need to do something meaningful in your life. It's like, okay, no problem, get your act together. That'll keep you busy for a while. Then if you manage that, well, see if you can do something about your family and see if you can get them together functioning well. And if you manage that, well, there's a whole community out there that could use some work. And so maybe you'll have the wherewithal at that point to make some wise decisions to make things better on a larger scale. And then there's no end to that. And if you ask why should I bother? You might say, well, how about reduction of suffering and constriction of malevolence? That would be a good reason. It's like, even if you don't believe that you could bring the utopia to light on earth, you might be able to constrain the degeneration of things into hell. That seems a worthwhile pursuit. How miserable do you want your family to be? Let's say that you have to maneuver in a room. Well, you want to know where the objects are so you don't run into them. Like when we walk into this room, our eyes are open and we see where the pillars are and we see where the chairs are. And so then we can orient ourselves properly in the room, and science does that for us. It says, well, here, as far as we can tell, here's the ground reality. This is what we have to work with. It's okay, well, now what can we do with that? Science also helps us develop technologies that enable us to maneuver, but it's not particularly useful in establishing directions for ethical endeavor. It's very difficult to use the scientific methodology to rank order facts in terms of their value. Right? Because in some sense, because the facts are objective, they're all of equal value. None, in some sense. Part of what you do when you're a scientist is take the value off the facts. Right? And so then you're left with the valueless facts. Well, they're potential tools at hand, but you still have to determine how you're going to apply them. So, so if you learn to split the atom, well, then you can make nuclear reactors and you can power the entire French grid, or you can make hydrogen bombs. The facts, in some sense, are neutral with regards to the purpose to which they're put. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's not a bad first pass approximation.